The Jaecoo E5 is the manufacturer's first fully electric SUV, and it's a compact one at that. Now, at the time of filming and in UK, it's available in two separate trims. The Pure at roughly £27,500 and the Luxury at roughly £30,500. This is actually roughly £2,000 to £3,000 more than the fully petrol model that the manufacturer also offers. Now, for this, you're also getting a 7-year warranty or 100,000 miles, whichever comes first. Then you also have got a no mileage limit on the first 3 years and RAC home starts. Furthermore, you've got 8 years or 100,000 miles, whichever comes first on the battery pack. Now, in this review, which will be covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag and, of course, how it compares to some of its key competitors. But before proceeding, I would just like to point out that if you do want to find some of the best deals for it, make sure you check out the links down in the description below or the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. So to kick things off, let's talk about its electric range. And here you've got a 61.1 kilowatt hour battery pack with an LFP chemistry, that stands for lithium iron phosphate. And the manufacturer claims that you'll get 248 miles from the WLTP test cycle. However, from my own mixed driving tests, which were done on country roads and in and around the city, I actually netted a pretty impressive 190 to 210 miles. Now, as you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboard, that actually does fare pretty well. In fact, in comparison to some of its nearest competitors, which are actually a little bit more expensive, that is actually really impressive. So what Jaecoo have been able to manage within the E5 is certainly something to behold. However, in comparison to some of its rivals, it does not have a heat pump, which is a little bit disappointing. Indeed, on those colder climate days, which we're used to in the UK, it means that you can get reduced efficiency because it's not as good as heating up the cabin. And therefore means on the motorway and on those winter days, you're just going to be getting a lot less range than you might expect. And this is where some of its competitors do actually offer a slight bit of an upper hand. Now, another thing I would also like to highlight is that I'm not too fond of the regenerative braking feel. Here you've got 3 different modes which can be selected via the infotainment system, which is very much appreciated. You've got low, medium and high. However, I actually found that going on the medium or high mode, no matter what sort of drive mode I selected, the regen braking feel and the biting point per se was actually really sensitive and just really hard to predict, to say the least. And therefore meant that I just had to go on the low mode and just expect the vehicle to just regen at a slower rate and therefore decelerate a little less harshly when I lift off the accelerator pedal. Potentially not a deal breaker for certain individuals, but it's just something to highlight, and especially when it comes to comparing and contrasting it with its competitors, again, it's just something that you might want to look at. Furthermore, the Jaecoo E5 does not have a full one-pedal driving mode, which will come as a disappointment to certain individuals. Now, of course, you do have the ability of plugging it in, and here via its CCS port, you have the ability of recouping up to 80 kilowatts of input, and therefore meaning that you can go from 30 to 80% in under half an hour. You have also got an 11 kilowatt onboard charger, which is certainly appreciated as it allows you to access 3-phase power supply via its Type 2 port. Of course, the recharging time will take longer, specifically if you're going to be going on a regular 7 kilowatt wall box or of course using a 3-pin input. Elsewhere, it is worth mentioning that as standard across the entire trim range, you have got vehicle to load charging, which effectively means that you can discharge the vehicle's battery pack and therefore power, let's say, a household appliance. Quite handy, for example, if you go camping, therefore allowing you to plug in, let's say, a kettle and turn it on, or indeed just pump up your airbed. Now, past all of this, we should also talk about driving comfort. And here I was actually left pleasantly surprised. The vehicle is actually pretty soft and subtle when it comes to going in and around country roads or over speed bumps or anomalies on the motorway. Indeed, it's actually quite nicely set up. Of course, it's just not as well tuned as more advanced suspension system configurations, let's say adaptive air suspension systems or the more advanced system that Citroën offer, for example, with the EC4, the EC3, or for example the EC4X, among others. But nonetheless, over here, for the vast majority of consumers, I think you'll actually be left pretty surprised at what the manufacturer's been able to achieve. Now, there is good also cabin noise, and this is also due to the fact that you've got silent glass that's effectively laminated side windows, at least at the front, and also windscreen, and therefore means that the overall cabin noise is suppressed, therefore allowing you to just enjoy a bit more serenity within the Jaecoo E5. Elsewhere, in terms of the overall driving feel, well, here it is not exactly a sporty SUV, at least not in my opinion. And despite the manufacturer's best efforts, you haven't really got a one-to-one connection with the front axle. You do also suffer from a little bit of body lean, but given the fact that you are looking at a compact SUV, it's actually not too bad. So this actually perfectly brings me on to performance, and here you've got 152 kilowatts of power, which translates to 204 horsepower and 288 newton meters of torque, which are dispatched to the front wheels only. So yes, indeed, you have got a front wheel drive configuration. Now, using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch, I actually had it tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 2.31 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 3.01 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 7.51 seconds, which is pretty much bang on with the manufacturer's claim, and then 50 to 70 miles an hour in 3.42 seconds. I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.7 G. Now, as for its top speed, it is electronically limited to 108 miles an hour, which should certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers, but might come as a disappointment to those who actually live near unrestricted roads. Now, another thing I would also like to point out is that the overall braking performance of the Jaecoo E5 was actually pretty impressive, coming to an emergency standstill when it came to doing it in a safe manner on a country road. It actually decelerated the vehicle really rapidly, therefore giving me good level of confidence. Of course, be it if I have to ever use it in the future, or indeed when it came to just going around winding country routes at speed, it meant that I knew that I had good sort of braking performance to rely on. So next up we get onto its interior design, and here I really do love what the manufacturer has achieved within the E5. It actually does look the part, namely if you compare and contrast it with some of its key competitors. You've got good use of materials that are found towards the dashboard, the door trims, and also the stitching work and the upholstery. Well, here I've got no complaints. You've also got the degree of personalization with an ambient lighting system which kind of wraps around the cabin, therefore allowing you to kind of play around with it depending on if that's something that you like doing. It's also pretty practical thanks to the use of physical buttons that are found on the steering wheel. And yes, they do look like capacitive and haptic buttons like you find on Volkswagen, but that's not the case, which is very much appreciated. Furthermore, you've got physical stalks that are found behind the steering wheel, one of which is actually used for your drive mode selector. Now, all the other controls, for example your climate, will actually have to be done via the portrait 13.2-inch display. And this is actually a non-issue because the display itself is super fluid and responsive. This is thanks to the fact that you have got the Snapdragon 8155 chipset, and therefore means that when it comes to going between menus, there's no sort of lag. And given the fact that it also supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay over a wired and wireless transmission, means that it's actually pretty well connected. Now, as an extension to this, you've also got an 8.8-inch fully digitalized instrument cluster. It's somewhat customizable in terms of its right-hand menu, but otherwise will provide you all the key driving information that you require, such as your traversing speed and the safety systems that are in operation. Now, it is worth considering, however, that a head-up display does not come included as an option or indeed as standard in the top spec model, which might come as a disappointment to certain individuals because there are some other vehicles that do offer said feature within its price category, but in all honesty, it doesn't bother me all that much. Now, furthermore, you've also got a 6-speaker Sony audio system in the Pure model. However, in the Luxury, this moves over to an 8-speaker configuration instead. Therefore, that you've got 2 audio drivers within each of the 4 doors. It does well across the sound frequency range and will suffice for the vast majority of consumers, although audiophiles might be left a little bit disappointed in that it doesn't provide you that low-end bass, and also in terms of the overall vocals, well, they don't really come out to the foreground. Also, I would like to highlight that Jaecoo do also have an app for the fully electric model, which is pretty much appreciated, allowing you to precondition the cabin and do a variety of different controls from afar. So next up we get onto storage, and here it's great to see that the manufacturer has optimized storage within the cabin, for example the glove box for right-hand drive vehicles. Then you'll find a small little storage area that can be found behind the center display. Good thinking by the manufacturer because it can be quite handy for taking smaller size valuables. It's also got a non-slip material which prevents your loose change or keys from rattling about. Further down, you've also got 2 areas for smartphones, and these are actually been lined in a sort of fabric material. And here it will also double up as a singular wireless charger in the Luxury trim. Further down, you'll find 2 cup holders and also a pretty large area that can be found within the center armrests. Underneath the center console, you've also got another open area, although here you've got no non-slip material, so therefore just worth bearing that in mind. And you've got a USB Type A and Type C ports, which can be handy for connecting up to the infotainment system or of course providing charge. In the luxury trims, you'll also find a 12-volt socket, and there's also another 12-volt socket that will be found in the boot. Now, in terms of the rear portion of the center console, you have got a singular USB Type-A port, which can be handy for providing charge for your rear occupants. In terms of the door bins, the front two are pretty large and will easily accommodate a 500ml bottle, while the rear two are unsurprisingly a little bit more limited. There is also a pull-down armrest compartment with two cup holders, although this is only again present in the luxury trim. Now, of course, when it comes to storage, we have to talk about its boot. And here you've got 480 litres to play around with, or 1,180 litres if you drop down the seats. The former figure is actually pretty impressive considering its overall form factor and size. It's also very practical. You have got a hatchback design, and as someone who's just under 6 foot, I had no issues whatsoever when it came to accessing the back of the vehicle. And you've also got a manually operated tailgate in the Pure trim and electronically operated within the luxury trim. Here you have also got 60/40 rear split folding seats and a flat loading bay. You've also got an adjustable boot floor, so therefore if you do want that additional bit of storage, then you can certainly benefit from it. Despite the fact of dropping the boot floor, you will still find yourself that you have got a very large underfloor compartment, making it handy for lesser used goods or, for example, your charging cables. On that note, you might want to actually place your charging cables within the front compartment. Yes, indeed, there's a small little area underneath the bonnet allowing you to use this. Although bear in mind, it won't be as practical to use on a day-to-day basis because you have to use the release lever that's found within the car, almost like when you pop in the hood with an engine. Now, nonetheless, it's good to see that Jaecoo have actually optimized the front of the vehicle because a lot of other manufacturers have actually become lazy in this department, even in the modern era. And despite the fact that the Jaecoo E5 shares the platform and same sort of form factor as the petrol model, which is the Jaecoo E5, it's good to see that the manufacturer has actually thought it through. However, one thing it is worth mentioning that there is no towing capacity, and this might come as a disappointment to certain individuals. On the subject of the two different powertrains, it is worth mentioning over here that the fully electric model has got a pet mode, which isn't actually found on the petrol model. And this can be quite handy if you have got pets because you can place them within the car and therefore have the air conditioning run as you might expect. And you've also got a notification like you'd find, for example, on a Tesla. So it's good thinking by the manufacturer. Now, this does actually bring me on to seating comfort. And first off, the seats themselves are actually very easy to clean and also scratch and wear resistant, at least according to the manufacturer. Again, doubling down on terms of the overall pet mode and the capabilities of actually having pets within the vehicle. Now, the seats themselves at the front are manually operated with 6-way controls in the Pure trim. However, in the luxury model, you have got heated, ventilated, electronically operated front seats and also a heated steering wheel. So yes, indeed, you've got additional comfort within the luxury trim. In terms of the seats themselves, they're very accommodating and soft. And in terms of headroom and legroom, I had no issues whatsoever at the front or at the rear of the cabin, even as someone like myself who's just under 6 foot. And it's also good to see that the manufacturer has optimized the rear footwell design. Yet again, good sort of nods to the manufacturer, despite that the E5 is actually shared in terms of platform with the petrol model. Now, I would also like to highlight that if you do want to draw in some extra light within the cabin, you certainly might want to consider the luxury trim because it adds a panoramic roof with an electronically operated sunshade, which I absolutely love. This perfectly brings me onto its exterior design, and a lot of people online have actually compared this to a Range Rover, and I can see why, both in terms of its front and rear profile. But I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comments section below. Subjectively, I really do love what the manufacturer's achieved. At the front, you've got this nice sort of curved design, specifically in the fully electric model, because you have got a completely covered grille, which makes sense. Then towards the side, you've got a nice sort of silhouette with body-colored wheel arches and also 18-inch alloys that come fitted as standard across the entire trim range. At the rear, you've got a somewhat sporty flair due to the inclusion of a spoiler and those relatively slender tail lights. Frankly, over here, I've got no complaints whatsoever. In terms of the colors, it comes in white as standard. If, however, you want blue, grey, black or the pictured green, they'll cost you an additional £500. You've also got two-tone finishes for £1,000, which I do think is actually pretty reasonable. So while that's all very well and good, what about when it comes to safety? Well, at the time of filming, the Jaecoo E5 and the Jaecoo E5 have not been tested by Euro NCAP, so therefore I do not have any sort of crash analysis. Although it's worth bearing in mind over here, its sibling, the Omoda 5, did receive the full 5 out of 5 stars, so therefore one might expect the Jaecoo to be similarly as impressive. Now, in terms of the driver assistance systems, you've got a whole bunch of them that come included as standards. Level 2 autonomous driving, adaptive cruise control, which does actually work a treat on the road by keeping you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle, although sometimes can feel a little bit jerky. Then you've got collision mitigation systems, lane change assist, driver monitoring system, which I did find to be overly sensitive, lane departure prevention, and rear cross traffic alert. Now, indeed, all these systems are included, and it is also worth bearing in mind they will become re-enabled every single time you step inside the vehicle, no matter your last used setting. Now, Jaecoo have tried to think of this by providing you a shortcut, and in terms of the drop-down, which you can access via the notification, like you'd find, for example, on a smartphone, but some of the systems will still have to be disabled by going within the infotainment system, and therefore can feel like a little bit of a faff. It would have been great here if the manufacturer had thought about adding shortcuts, for example, on the steering wheel to disable some of the systems. It's also worth mentioning over here that not all of them are actually grouped within the ADAS menu, for example, the driver attention warning, and therefore means that you'll just have to get your head around it each time you step inside the vehicle. Now, to conclude, I would like to talk about parking and visibility, and in both areas the vehicle is actually really good. First off, in terms of the turning circle, it's actually pretty tight, and with the light steering wheel feel, it makes it very easy to do a 3-point turn. Visibility at the front, side and rear are a non-issue. And it's also worth mentioning over here that you've got front and rear parking sensors that come included as standard, and similarly you have got a 540-degree camera system. We've also got a high resolution, therefore giving you good peace of mind when it comes to doing any sort of parking maneuver, and saves you from curbing your rims or of course hitting any sort of objects. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to a verdict of the Jaecoo E5. And yes, there are certain things that the manufacturer could have worked on, be it in terms of the regenerative braking feel that could have been better optimized, or indeed the driver assistance systems that can be a little bit cumbersome because they become re-enabled every single time and there's no easy shortcut. But still, in the grand scheme of things, I do think that the manufacturers really nailed it, specifically at this price point. You're getting good sort of electric range, pretty comfortable driving experience, plenty of tech that is featured within the cabin, and it also feels relatively luxurious. You've also got a decent boot capacity as well. Combining all of this and also comparing and contrasting it with some of its competitors, I can definitely see myself recommending it, and as such it gets our Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of the E5 down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares to some of its key competitors. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I hope we see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.